17 Scary True Stories from Reddit.
I think about her every day. A woman who went to my regular pub was out with her friend during the day, and in the evening she missed a bus home and ended up in another pub. She was tipsy and ended up going home with a man who lived with another male. They both had an obsession with serial killers and murdered her, and after they killed her, they chopped her body up. They spent the next week putting her body in plastic bags and hiding them in bushes, etc. They were caught pretty quickly and thankfully are in prison for life. The day she went missing, I saw her in the pub with her friend and stood in the smoking area with her laughing about a pigeon who was chilling too. I have a video where she is in it and she makes a joke just hours before her death. I think about her nearly every day. It's something that is sort of traumatizing, and she did not deserve such a cruel ending to her life.
Bullet dodged. When I was 7, I was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard, and a beat-up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood, and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I did indeed know how. "Yes," I responded. "Give me a hand real quick," he said. So I started walking towards his truck. At the last second, my mom called out to me from the garage, and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, the truck start, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day, about 30 years later. I jump up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and it hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the fuck? What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory. I was shaking for at least a half hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it.
Life moves fast. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first, and she would fly over a week or two later, due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining she was concerned for their welfare and she had had no contact with them, and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change.
Abusive ex. My mother's friend left her abusive husband. My mother met her while working at a women's shelter. They were really close, and my mother fought so hard to get her somewhere safe. They did everything right. She helped her file divorce papers. And then one morning my mom can't get her on the phone, but they'd had plans to meet for lunch. And she checks the newspaper. And she calls in sick to work, which she never did. And she sat me down in tears and told me what happened. Her friend was home with her son when her ex broke in. He killed her and left the baby there in his mother's blood. And then he hung himself outside of Raleigh's. Last I heard, their almost 2-year-old went to live with his uncle. I can't imagine how terrifying it was for the baby to cry to himself in his mother's blood for the almost 2 days until he was found.
Camper. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend, and she had the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents, and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff.
On the third day he fell silent. Everything to do with Hajj Muhammad Misfui. He was a shoemaker who lived in Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. He and his accomplice, a 70-year-old woman called Anna, used to drug and kill young women who came to the shop. Eventually, one of the victim's parents traced her movements to the shop, and after the remains of 36 mutilated corpses were discovered nearby, Misfui and Anna were questioned and tortured. Anna didn't survive, but Misfui confessed to murdering them, usually for a tiny amount of money. His initial sentence was crucifixion, a very unusual punishment even then. However, there were many protests from powerful foreign embassies, and Morocco couldn't do much against them. Instead, he was sentenced to beheading, a more common punishment. However, the mood in Marrakech was that this was far too lenient, so they settled on immurement, being walled up alive. A special cell was constructed in the wall of the bazaar, about 2x6 feet. Chains were attached to one wall to ensure he would be kept standing. Misfui wasn't told of his fate until the morning of his execution, when he was led, screaming, in chains and slowly bricked up inside. Once the last course had been laid, the crowd would fall silent until he started screaming, when they would cheer. He screamed nearly constantly for 2 days. On the third day he fell silent.
James Bulger. He was just 2 years old and with his mom running errands. She let go of his hand to pay the cashier, and he wandered away. 2 10-year-old boys spotted him, lured him toward them, took him by the hands and led him away. They took him to a remote location, pushing and kicking at him the whole time. Some people questioned the 2 kids with the crying toddler, but they lied, saying he was their brother, and nobody intervened further. They took him to a secluded spot and tortured him. I don't want to recount the torture details, it's just too gruesome. They left his body on some railroad tracks, hoping that being run over by a train would make it look like an accident. He was found days later, his body severed in half by a train. The boys were caught and became the youngest convicted murderers in British history. Security footage from the day they took James shows them watching children, picking out a target. And they were just kids themselves. They were released at 18. One of them is back in jail for possessing child abuse photos on his computer. The most terrifying thing about this for me is that my own son is only 2 now, and James' murderers were just children, too. It was premeditated and intentional and entirely random. Just a momentary lapse in attention, and he became a target of 2 murderous children. Children. To think that children younger than my stepson are capable of such a thing, ugh. Everything about this case is just horrifying.
The corpse add up. My dad worked in a morgue during college in the 60s. One time on the night shift he was training a recent hire who was wheeling a body down the hallway. The body was under a sheet, but all of a sudden started to sit up. The guy immediately freaked out, ran out the doors and quit. Apparently a dead body can have muscle contractions in the abs causing it to start sitting up.
stone cold. I grew up in a funeral home. I helped out in the office. When I was about 15, we got a call from a man whose wife and infant baby had been murdered in cold blood. There were very few clues. It made headlines. Cops set up surveillance at the viewing. It was heartbreaking, as the mother was holding the baby in her arms. I was asked to take the flower cards and periodically get the husband and ask if he recognized the names. I then photocopied them and put them back. I did it because I was a kid, people knew me, and I was unobtrusive. I talked to the husband quite a bit. He seemed devastated and shaken. The cops told me they had an eyewitness to someone leaving the house the day of the murder. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She recognized the man leaving. It was the husband's best friend. Turns out that the friend and the husband had made a pact to kill each other's families and run off with their secretaries. The little girl identified the friend, and I guess one of them cracked. They both went to jail on multiple counts, all on the testimony of a 3-year-old. I still cannot believe to this day that that man stood right beside me multiple times, and I had no clue. I don't think I ever looked at life the same way after that.